I'm curious about human dietary behavior, about the choices that we make, the types of foods that we eat in our everyday lives, and the amounts of food that we eat, essentially sort of drivers of appetite, the nuts and bolts of how we interact with food. My name is Jeff Brunstrom, and I'm a professor of experimental psychology at the University of Bristol in the UK.
And can you tell me more about your work in general overall?
I co-lead the Nutrition and Behavior Unit, which is based it's in the School of Psychology and Neuroscience. And believe it or not, we've got a lab that has a kitchen in it. It's a sort of semi kind of industrial kitchen, but it allows us to prepare food. And on a very regular basis, we bring often undergraduates, sometimes member of staff into our lab. And then we will prepare different types of food, ask politely our participants to eat that food. And then we can measure, how that affects their appetite or the subsequent food choices. We can just learn how people interact with food in a controlled study. And that allows us to develop theories of dietary behavior gradually over time.
It is so fascinating. I mean, the perspective that you're coming at and looking at food from versus just purely the nutritional or more clinical or physiological, right? Because it seems clear to me that food is majorly psychologically based. And I don't think I've known someone who has focused more on that aspect, but maybe there are a lot of people. I don't know. Is this something that's common that someone could find someone to assist them or work with them on that psychological connection?
Some people think about how our food environment affects our food choices. So, in a sense, when we think about the sort of blame game, we like to sort of think about, say, the food industry or our food environment having an effect, an external effect on our behavior and downstream our health. And then there are others, and I would probably subscribe to this, that feel that actually, you know, the relationship that we have with food is a bit more dynamic, and that we distinguish foods based on their competition. We show what sometimes we call nutritional intelligence. We interact, so our physiology interacts with our behavior, influences our behavior, and quite a complex way. We use that to discriminate and pick foods. So yeah, I don't think we're passive. I think that understanding our behavior, how we interact with food, is probably key to understanding how our food influences our health.
Can you tell me about your recent research study where you were looking at whole foods versus ultra processed foods?
It wasn't really our study, actually. We're very grateful to Professor Kevin Hall, who conducted the original study as part of it. It was an NIH funded study looking at the effects of exposure to ultra processed foods. Its paper was published in 2019. He had a study where he invited people into his laboratory. Actually, it was a metabolic ward, and they were there for a month. That was a way to study the effects of ultra processing on food intake. And what he discovered was remarkable, really, in that he showed that when the participants were eating their ultra processed diet, they were brought these trays of food, and then he measured how much of the food they consumed and measured that to the nearest gram. And so it was a way over 2 weeks to just look at what ultra processing does. And what he found was that they ate 500 calories more on average per day when they were eating the ultra processed diet, and they also gained weight relative to the other condition where they were given unprocessed food. That was a study that really was a bit of a game changer. It just changed the way people thought about ultra processing. It sparked lots of debate in and around the world. Policymakers then making decisions about whether or not ultra processed foods might be harmful for health, and in particular might be harmful for energy balance, weight gain, overweight, and obesity. And so we were interested to know, well, what did they do when they interacted with those traits? Because the key thing about the study was that, and what was reported, and what's often remembered, is that the two diets were matched. So they were matched for their energy content, their protein, carbohydrate, fat, fiber, and so on. So they were perfectly matched. And so that left lots of academics and scientists sort of scratching their heads trying to figure out, was it about these diets that led to 500 calories more consumed in the ultra processed condition?
So, in your study, what did you find after reviewing the data from the previous study?
The key findings was that when people were consuming the unprocessed diet, the meals were actually larger. In other words, they were heavier or they weighed more. So they were larger by mass, which is interesting because it was something that isn't often reported when we think about that paper. But actually, the difference was quite large. It was 57% larger meals by mass with the unprocessed diet. So we looked at the specific foods that people were choosing. And what was surprising to us was people were eating a lot of low energy dense foods. In other words, foods with an energy density less than 1 calorie per gram. So these are essentially fruits and vegetables. They ate an awful lot of broccoli. So when we looked at, so of course they're not eating everything on the tray. Some is left over. One of the things that we were worried about was that they were just eating lots of broccoli because there were no other more calorie-rich foods available. And it turns out that wasn't the case. They could have picked more energy-rich foods, but actually they ate a lot of very low energy dense foods.
Can you tell me more about why people were drawn to these low energy dense foods?
We did have a look at the composition of these foods. And of course, we all know that fruits and vegetables contain a lot of micronutrients, minerals, vitamins in particular. And when we looked at the data closely, it occurred to us that had the participants not selected those low energy dense fruits and vegetables, then not immediately, but over time, they might have become deficient in certain micronutrients. However, they were doing it, it appears that the selection of those was at least addressing a nutritional need. How they do it and what the underlying mechanism might be is a bit unclear at this stage. But if we think of this perhaps as an example of nutritional intelligence, but there's more work to be done there.
What were some of the options that were more higher calories than the fruits and vegetables that were on their plate?
Certainly meat. There was some oils, some dressings, some nuts, couscous, olives are a good example of foods that yeah contain more calories, but were ultimately rejected in favor of some of those nutrient dense low calorie fruits and vegetables.
Also, what other factors did you find in this data?
We've been interested in what it is about certain foods that leads to overconsumption. So we know that some foods we can consume them in larger portions, larger calorie amounts than others. And other groups have started to look at the blend of macronutrients in food, in particular, the extent to which there might be a kind of a sweet spot, a blend of fat and carbohydrate that promotes increased energy intake. So in a set of controlled studies in our lab, we've been looking at whether or not if you compare foods that derive their energy, their calories from a blend of fat and carbohydrate, whether or not they can actually be consumed in larger portions than, for example, foods that are high in carbohydrate or foods that are high in energy from fat. And we've shown that in a number of different ways. There appears to be this blending effect that can elevate and increase our energy intake. That's seen actually in lots of modern foods. And we demonstrated that in the data that Kevin Hall provided, that in his ultra processed meal components, they tended to have more of this kind of characteristic. They tended to be formed from a more optimal, therefore, sort of blend of energy from fat and carbohydrate.
If you can please tell me more about nutritional intelligence and how you refer to it as micronutrient deleveraging.
It's a concept, it's an idea. Going back to what I was saying earlier about this sort of tension between thinking about how we interact with our food environment and how views are somewhat polarized. Some thinking that we are really at the mercy of our food environment, whatever we find available to us. And then others that think there's a more complex interaction with foods, where we are guided by our physiology and show underlying structure and decision making around food. In other words, we respond to the composition of foods in different ways. That I think kind of captures the idea of nutritional intelligence. And a component of that is perhaps asking the question, is our or can our food choices sometimes be guided both by the value that we place on individual macronutrients? That's one question, but also the value perhaps implicitly that we might place on foods that happen to contain lots of micronutrients. That's what we showed might be going on in the data we analyzed in Kevin Hall's study. And micronutrient deleveraging really refers to this trade off because it turns out that in an unprocessed diet, you have foods that contain lots of micronutrients, so they would tend to be fruits and vegetables. And then you have foods that contain lots of calories. And of course, you do get some micronutrients in calorie containing foods. But as I've already said, yeah, to have a balanced diet, you have to have both kinds of foods. But because we've only got one gut, one stomach, one capacity, often when we consume a meal, we have to combine both types of foods. And if we do that, if we consume a lot of very low energy dense fruits and vegetables, that actually kind of limits, it deleverages the total calories that we can consume in a meal. And then if you contrast that with, say, ultra processed food, take, for example, I don't know, frozen pizza or something where everything is sort of mushed into one. Sometimes they're fortified as well, ultra processed foods. So you've co-located your calories with your micronutrients and you remove the need for that fruits and vegetables in that sense. And so you remove that deleveraging effect. And we think that is what might elevate, increase the number of calories that people consume when they're exposed to the ultra processed food. So that effect is, in a sense, a mirror image of micronutrient deleveraging, what we see when we typically eat an unprocessed diet.
When we do take a moment to think about what it is that we want to eat at that moment, there is kind of a tapping into maybe that nutritional intelligence and that ability to understand, is there something that my body is asking for that I need to listen to and not just grab something easy and processed? Is that something that you've heard about? Is that something you're interested in researching or an aspect of this people's relationship and connection to food that is included in the nutritional intelligence aspect or no?
I mean, I think that what I've come to realize is that people really care about food. They really care about what's on their plate. Have a choice between having peas on the plate or carrots on their plate. They have a view on that. And I think that's interesting. It's not the case that we just blindly seek calories. If it was the case that we just blindly seek calories, then we'd be eating fat and sugar. It's not the case. I think there are kind of two schools of thought. One is that, well, we just eat what everybody else eats, and we are encultured to make those kinds of decisions. And then there's another school of thought, which is that the fine-tuned decisions that we make about food, the decision to have olives on our pizza or not, now might be guided by some underlying nutritional intelligence, or informed at least by sense of what might be appropriate that connects us with nutrition provided by food in ways that we don't necessarily understand yet.
What research projects are you currently working on, if you can share?
A challenge for us is to recognize the health implications of a poor diet. The effects of diet on diet related disease is considerable both here in the UK and the US and elsewhere. And although we now have available to us GLP-1 agonists that can play an incredibly important role in addressing that, we nevertheless have to think about how we change our dietary environment, the foods that we have available to us. We need to be able to offer advice, but it has to be informed advice. Although we have a very clear understanding that there are certain kinds of foods that lead to overconsumption, there is still nevertheless a lot of uncertainty about what happened to our dietary environment.
Are you interested in looking at GLP-1s and how that affects people's nutritional intelligence?
I think there's lots and lots of scope to look at, how people's food choices change. Absolutely. So, although we know that we see, really, profound effects of GLP-1s on energy balance and weight loss, now we don't know so much yet about how that's affecting the lived experience of people who are taking those medications. And in particular, we don't know so much about how that influences their food choices. So I think that I would completely agree that there's a whole set of questions there about the underlying behavioral mechanism, not just because I think that's important to understand how they work and their mechanism of action from a behavioral perspective, but also because that might teach us something more generally about our dietary behavior and how our physiology and changes in physiology impact and downstream influence the choices that we make.
There are also studies about how GLP-1s reduce um, like addictions and help people who are alcoholics and who have other addictions as well. And so I wonder if it helps their addiction kind of with food as well, and that changes their relationship and what they decide to consume. And if they then stop those GLP-1s, are they able to continue those habits?
Absolutely. And I know lots of people, right now, sort of scratching their heads thinking along the same line. What will be the long term effects of people losing lots of weight, but then perhaps regaining weight rather rapidly when they come off GLP-1s? How can we entrain good behaviors when people are losing weight on GLP-1s to mitigate the effects that we think we will see when they come off GLP-1s? Also, as you say, understanding the connection between appetite and addictive behaviors associated with gambling and smoking, alcohol, and so on. These are really important questions. And you're probably right. These things are, directly connected. They're the same sort of neural pathways are involved in all of these sorts of behaviors. Personally, I'm a really big advocate for developing paradigms that demonstrate ecological validity, that can tap into and can understand the lived experience of people who are on these medications or attempting any kind of weight loss intervention. It's actually what we do in the moment and the decisions that we make that are trivial, but all add up over time. And so, understanding that I think is really important.
It's those micro moments almost that are the most important to understand.
If you look at what people eat, and sometimes people, as part of what are called diet diary stems, they report what they eat, they recall what they eat and write it down. And then we can look at the reports of thousands of people over several days. And it's really interesting just to sort of browse through and peek into the lives of people who have reported that. One of the things that I think is really, really clear is that when you look at somebody's dietary choices over a series of days, it looks completely random. Some days they eat loads of food, sometimes they eat loads of sugary food, sometimes they eat very little. I like this sort of analogy with a kind of a wash basket on a laundry basket. If you were to kind of look through, take out what's in a laundry basket, you might find that, there's a t-shirt, a pair of gloves, I don't know, pair of thick socks, some jeans, some shorts, gym gear, and so on. And, if you were to look at that, you'd just assume, well, the person is wearing random stuff. In much the same way, if you looked at diet diary data, you'd just say, well, what can we learn here? It's all random. But, of course, with the laundry basket analogy, we know that, for example, weather probably plays, and if it's a cold day, people will wear more clothes. There's a reason why people are wearing different things. And that's really clear. What I'm looking for is what is the common denominator? What's the structure? What's the reasoning that explains why I eat a load one day, rather little the next, the high protein meals the next day, and so on? But is it just randomness, or is there a connection that exposes some underlying nutritional intelligence or reasoning? And that's what I'm really, after. That's what I really want to understand.
What would you most wish that people would take away from understanding your publication about whole foods and ultra processed foods?
I think that it's important to recognize that this was a reanalysis of a relatively small scale study. So we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions. But they do at least can confirm that there are perhaps sensible mechanisms that can start to explain why exposure to the kind of ultra processed diet that was fed to participants in Kevin Hall's study might lead to overconsumption. So a better understanding of not just the perils perhaps of an ultra processed diet, but also the reason and the positive benefit of being exposed to an unprocessed diet. Yeah, I think the take home is that, yeah, we can enjoy an unprocessed diet. And it's perhaps that enjoyment of an unprocessed diet that explains why that kind of diet also can lead to the consumption of fewer rather than more calories.
Thank you, Professor Brunstrom, for joining us today and for sharing your research with us. It was great learning more about your work.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.